The office of the presidency was created in the Constitution of the United States. Certain men, more than others, increased the power of that office. The man who changed the presidency the most tried to change the Constitution itself.
In 1932, Roosevelt seemed an unlikely candidate for the presidency of the United States. The country was poor, and he had never been poor. He was an only child, and he acted like an only child. The working man was in desperate need of being understood, and he had never been a working man. The office of the presidency demanded physical strength and stamina. From the age of 39, when he contracted poliomyelitis, he had been paralyzed from the waist down. He is, wrote a popular columnist of the time, a pleasant man who, with no important qualifications for the job, would like very much to be president. 12 years later, it would be hard to imagine anyone else as president. His power and magnetism were such that he attracted a crowd wherever he went. He was a star. You loved him for the way he wore his battered fedora, or you hated him for what appeared to be an arrogant tilt of the chin. Everyone knew what he had said and done, and how he had said it, and how he had done it.
History proves that dictatorships do not grow out of strong and successful governments, but out of weak and helpless ones. We are a rich nation. We can afford to pay for security and prosperity without having to sacrifice our liberties into the bargain. I have said not once but many times that I have seen war and that I hate war. I say that again and again. I hate war. The men and women who are unemployed are our problem. We must help to get them back to reemployment.
There were 125 million people here in 1932. The unemployment line was 17 million men long. And as though the man-made disaster wasn't bad enough, nature produced dust and windstorms in the Midwest that blew whole farms away, or at least the dirt on them that would grow anything. Americans left the farms, but the cities offered only more despair. Whole families lived in shanty towns. They were nicknamed, not in honor but dishonor, Hoovervilles, after the President of the United States. Desperate men, willing to do anything for a buck, offer their services for any job available for exactly that amount, $1 a week. In Chicago, people couldn't afford coal. Mayor Cermak let them dig the wooden paving blocks up out of the streets to take home to burn. Somehow the apple became the symbol of respect for many unemployed too proud to beg. Apples were sold on busy street corners all across America. There was an unspoken understanding that it wasn't so much that the buyer was hungry for an apple as it was that he had a nickel he was willing to share. In the White House, the glum and cheerless Herbert Hoover, who had saved the poor of Europe after World War I, was unable to save his own country. Prosperity, he kept saying, is just around the corner. June of 1932, 20,000 veterans of World War I, broke and hungry, marched on Washington. Congress had voted them a $500 bonus to be paid in 1945. They wanted it now. Hoover insulated himself against the noise of the mob. He refused to see its leaders. On Thursday, June 28th, federal troops moved against this sorry army. They attacked with tanks, a cavalry unit with sabers drawn, and an infantry detachment with fixed bayonets. The federal troops, which first attacked civil service workers by mistake as they left work, was led by General Douglas MacArthur and his aide, Major Dwight Eisenhower. 2 of the bonus marchers were killed. 2 of their small children died from gas used by the troops. Their shacks were burned. It's not a day we celebrate with pride as a high point in our national history. The incident hurt the president's declining popularity. Charisma is that special quality a few people have for looking just right and being just right at the right time. Charisma is something Herbert Hoover didn't have any of. It was these 2 men, so different in lifestyles and personality, who were to face each other in the fight for the presidency of the United States.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Eleanor Roosevelt had actively encouraged Franklin to seek the presidency. For the opening of the campaign, they were joined at Hyde Park by the rest of the Roosevelts.
This is another partial reunion of the Roosevelt family. Sissy, what's our campaign slogan?
Happy days are here again.
Good, that's right.
More a wish than a fact, the slogan swept the country. The Roosevelt campaign style began to become familiar to the nation. The incumbent president seemed unable to change his style, or lack of one.
I find it difficult to express the very great appreciation that both Mrs. Hoover and I have for your coming in such enormous numbers to greet us here this morning.
Thank you. Fundamentally, Hoover did not believe he could legislate the country out of the Depression. As a conservative Republican, he didn't think it was right to use the power of this office to try. Roosevelt did, and the difference between them was that simple.
If you believe in that New Deal that I believe in, you will have done your part towards the restoration of the purity and the success of representative government throughout the land.
We are told by the opposition that we must have a change, that we must have a New Deal. It is not the change that comes from the normal development of national life to which I object or you object, but the proposal to alter the whole foundations of our national life, which have been built through generations of testing and struggle, and the principle upon which we have made this nation.
My friends, the time has come. The hour has struck.
And Franklin Roosevelt knew it was his time, his hour.
This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
5,000 banks had gone out of business, and with them had gone the life savings of millions of Americans who had thought banks were dependable. Now they were rushing to get their money out of the banks that were left, while the getting was good. That very night, Roosevelt moved into action. Legal or not, he decided to close all banks for 4 days. Because they had the feeling something was at last being done, people accepted the bank closing good-naturedly. There was no cash for anything. Without it, people exchanged token money and bartered anything they had.
Would you take the black card? Oh, thank you.
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
On March 9th, Congress passed Roosevelt's emergency banking bill into law without debate. At 8:36 that same evening, Roosevelt signed it into law. The bill allowed the Treasury Department to print paper money not backed by gold. It was the beginning of the Roosevelt Revolution. Bundles of bills were rushed to banks for their reopening Monday morning. The money shortage was over for the nation. The problem of easy money was just beginning. 1 week after he took office, Roosevelt gave the first of what became known as a fireside chat. They were not speeches. He talked to people in a conversational style anyone could understand.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. The bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. And it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
If Roosevelt closed the banks his first year, he opened the bars. Prohibition was repealed. The story should end here with everyone living happily ever after. That isn't what happened. The drought persisted. Breadlines remained. Millions of men and women with no work, no money, and nothing to do milled around in restless mobs. Communism was beginning to look very good to a great many people. The capitalist system itself was in danger. The National Recovery Act was supposed to change all that. In the summer of 1933, the initials NRA became as well known as Roosevelt's own. God knows the industry needed to recover. The United States steel was worth 8% of what it had been 3 years before. The average wage for anyone who could find a job was $16 a week, and most couldn't find one. The NRA called for a strange kind of voluntary compliance by American industry. They wrote their own codes and agreed to live by them in their own self-interest. They agreed to union bargaining, a 40-hour work week, minimum wage standards, and the elimination of child labor. The NRA created jobs. Some men picked up their first paycheck in 2 years. The act affected thousands of small businessmen, too. It may have been voluntary, but if you didn't have that little NRA sticker pasted up on your window, you just weren't very American. In San Francisco, 10,000 school children formed a human version of the NRA Blue Eagle. In Washington, support for President Roosevelt was not so unanimous.
The president seems entirely willing to mortgage the complete future of the American people, but suggests absolutely no method for paying off the mortgage. It looks to many of us as if we're headed straight toward national disaster. I remind the President of the United States of his own great statement the week he was inaugurated when he said, and I quote him literally, "Most liberal governments have been wrecked on the rocks of loose fiscal policy, and we must avoid this danger."
I have no expectation of making a hit every time I come to bat. What I seek is the highest possible batting average, not only for myself, but for the team.
When Franklin Delano Roosevelt first moved into the White House, the streets of Washington seemed wider. The pace was slower, the buildings lower, and there was grass growing between bureaus of the bureaucracy. Washington wasn't to stay that way long under Roosevelt. With the birth of the New Deal, there was an explosion of government. Between 1930 and 1945, the population of the United States increased by 9%. During that same period, the number of civil service workers increased by 402%. Getting people off the breadlines was one of Roosevelt's first concerns. The Civilian Conservation Corps was one of the most successful ideas he ever had. It took 2 million young men between the ages of 18 and 25 off city streets and put them to work on the land. This civilian army lived in camps under semi-military conditions. They were given $25 a month, a place to sleep, and all the food they could eat. The food alone was more than most of them had been getting.
How can a dime for? 15 I got. 20.
Thousands of farmers a day were losing everything to the auctioneer. They were dumping milk they couldn't sell, slaughtering pigs they couldn't afford to feed, and millions were going hungry in the cities. It was starvation in the land of plenty. Farmers had 13 million bales of cotton they couldn't sell, while men and women were freezing because they didn't have money for clothes. In an effort to help farmers, Roosevelt put through the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It paid farmers not to raise crops or to plow under the ones they had raised. If this was sound economic policy, it offended the American idea of what makes common sense. Farm supports were not the only area in which people doubted the president's wisdom. The Tennessee Valley Authority put the government in competition with private companies making electric power. American businessmen still haven't gotten over that. Mrs. Roosevelt represented her husband at the construction of the TVA's Great Norris Dam. Eleanor often went where Franklin was unable to go. Roosevelt was rarely seen by the public as he struggled to walk with his heavy leg braces, although he seemed less sensitive about pictures of him than others were. In January of 1935, Roosevelt proposed the Works Progress Administration. It was the most massive program of public jobs ever conceived. The WPA paid people a minimum living wage, and the work they did changed the face of America. They built roads, dams, post offices, airports, and bridges. Painters were paid to paint, actors to act, writers to write. I cannot say so out loud yet, Roosevelt wrote a friend, but I hope to be able to substitute work for relief. The chances are the post office in your town was built by the WPA.
What I have seen today makes me more enthusiastic about 4 little words than I ever have been before. Those 4 short words are these: it can be done.
But Roosevelt had set in motion an irreversible process. His friends called it social progress. His opponents, creeping socialism. The first time the government came between people and starvation was with its relief programs. Social Security came next.
The civilization of the past 100 years with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. Young people have come to wonder what would be their lot when they came to old age. The man with a job has wondered how long the job would last. This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 50 millions of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
FDR, riding high, reckoned without the conservative Supreme Court and Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Roosevelt derisively called them the 9 old men. The High Court found the NRA and the other New Deal legislation unconstitutional. In one day of decision, they had undone 2 years' work. The great Blue Eagle had been shot down in flight. In quick succession, the Supreme Court invalidated law after law, wiping out much of the New Deal recovery legislation. Only a month before the 1936 election, Roosevelt put aside his battle with the Supreme Court to campaign against the homespun Republican challenger from Kansas, Alf Landon.
If I'm elected, the budget is going to be balanced. And I'm not going to take 4 years to do it.
Of course we spent money. It went to put needy men and women without jobs to work. I tell you, and I think you will agree, that we are around the corner.
It was never much of a contest. With the detail of his re-election resolved, he returned to his battle with the Supreme Court. Roosevelt was convinced that the kind of legislation that the Supreme Court had thrown out was absolutely necessary. Unable to change the court's decision, he set out to change the court.
Whenever a judge or justice of any federal court has reached the age of 70 and does not avail himself of the opportunity to retire on a pension, a new member shall be appointed by the president then in office with the approval, as required by the Constitution, of the Senate of the United States. Our difficulty with the court today rises not from the court as an institution, but from human beings within it. We cannot yield our constitutional destiny to the personal judgment of a few men who, being fearful of the future, would deny us the necessary means of dealing with the present.
The nation did not approve of his attempt to make the Supreme Court a tool of his administration, and they let him know about it. Letters were overwhelmingly negative. His opponents, sensing he had made his first serious mistake, jumped to the attack.
The president's message asks for power to pack the Supreme Court. This is more power than has yet before been given to him. It is probably the utmost of power that Congress could grant to him. This is the most dangerous phase of the New Deal. The seizure of unlimited, unchecked power. This is the road to autocracy.
I am opposed to packing the court for the purpose of controlling its constitutional decisions, whether by the president or by anybody else. If the Constitution needs changing, let it be changed by the people. It belongs to them alone. In the present instance, they had better speak for themselves before it is too late.
Contrary to the belief of many, many Americans, the Constitution says nothing about any power of the court to declare legislation unconstitutional. Nor, parenthetically, does it mention the number of judges for the court.
The great Supreme Court battle raged for 168 days before the president lost it. Congress voted against the bill designed by him to fill the Supreme Court with friends. As if there weren't problems enough at home, there was a worse problem in Europe. The problem was Adolf Hitler and the threat of war. Hitler didn't seem that dangerous to American isolationists. They were more worried about what they thought Roosevelt was doing to their capitalist system. Roosevelt made an effort to reassure them, sometimes almost playfully.
You may have heard for 6 years that I was about to plunge the nation into war, that you and your little brothers would be sent to the bloody fields of battle in Europe, that I was driving the nation into bankruptcy, and that I breakfasted every morning on a dish of grilled millionaire. Actually, I am an exceedingly mild-mannered person, a practitioner of peace, both domestic and foreign, a believer in the capitalistic system, and for my breakfast, a devotee of scrambled eggs.
On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's German army and air force attacked Poland. It was becoming increasingly difficult for isolationists to pretend it didn't matter.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end, as long as it remains within my power to prevent. There will be no blackout of peace in the United States.
But the United States was providing war material, and war had done what 7 years of legislation had been unable to do: end the Great Depression. Roosevelt had become deeply enmeshed in the international crisis by 1940. He was more worried about the possibility of war than he dared say. Sometime in the spring of 1940, Roosevelt apparently decided to run for re-election. Not wanting to reinforce the feeling a lot of people had that he was becoming a dictator, he insisted that he be drafted at the Democratic Convention that summer. On July 18, 1940, Roosevelt was nominated for a third time. It was an honor and an obligation that no man had accepted since George Washington refused it in 1796.
I will, with God's help, continue to serve with the best of my ability and with the fullness of my strength.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt's strength was to carry him not only through a third term, but 3 months into a fourth. His last 5 years in office were occupied with World War II, but by then he had already given the modern presidency its shape. Only few times in all history has the character and personality of one man had such an influence on a nation as Roosevelt had in the United States. He imposed his will and philosophy on the government and changed the office of the presidency in the process. He forced the government to abandon its neutral role in the affairs of its people. He turned government into a force that directed the course and took responsibility for the events in our lives that had previously taken their own course.